what I'm going to be talking about, to a certain extent, I guess, echoes in a way some of the themes that were addressed in Audrey's keynote earlier, particularly as it relates to issues around the importance of dialogue and conversation. So I'm going to be talking about, I guess, broadly speaking, the conceptual and pedagogical framework that informs how I approach development education in my own teaching and in my own classrooms. But before I do that, I'm just going to say a little bit about what I personally, I guess, understand by development education and what I think it should strive to achieve. Because as we're all aware, development and development education it's really quite a contested and complex concept, where people can approach it from different sort of ideological positions and frameworks. So I suppose one of the things that I try to do in my own teaching is to be quite explicit about the particular ideological framework from which I'm approaching development and development education. So if you'll bear with me, I suppose, at the risk of oversimplifying what's in reality a very complex ethical project and pedagogical process, I view development education primarily as a dialogical space within which to raise fundamental questions about what's happening in the world, what's wrong with it, why is it happening, and ultimately what's it got to do with me and what I can do about it. And again, at the risk of oversimplifying, my view is that global injustices, whether we're talking about genocide, poverty, global hunger, famine and so on, that these are primarily political problems in the sense that they occur because of decisions and actions that are often taken very far away by institutions, international institutions and actors. So from this vantage point, a famine, for example, is not merely or indeed mainly something that occurs because of food shortages brought about by changing climates, but rather something that happens when segments of the population lose their ability to buy food. Whether that's due to rising food prices or the loss of income from cash crops due to the policies and choices of international institutions and agencies. All too often, dominant development theories and storylines erroneously suggest, in my mind, that countries in the global south are primarily responsible for the problems that they encounter, or a la modernization theory, that inhabitants of these countries lack the necessary human capital or motivation to achieve development. These theoretical frameworks or lenses through which to interpret so-called underdevelopment obscure the wider role of international institutions and political economic ideologies, and I'm talking here primarily, I suppose, about global capitalism, in creating and maintaining global poverty. Moreover, there's a tendency for mainstream development education interventions to promote uncomplicated or easy solutions to global problems that do not require systemic change. And for those of you who are familiar with the work of Vanessa Andriotti, she's done some kind of, I think, interesting work highlighting the problematics of kind of mainstream, or what she calls so-called sort of soft development education or global citizenship approaches. In our analysis of representations of international development in second-level schools, which we wrote up in a report called Learning to Read the World, which was funded by Irish Aid, Melissa Bracken and I found that development education in the formal and informal curriculum is often undergirded by this so-called soft approach to global citizenship that Vanessa Andriotti speaks of, which encourages young people to take action in response to crises and trends as significant as global warming, global poverty, and the unjust policies and practices of transnational corporations, primarily through individualized, voluntaristic, and sort of like-good or feel-good actions, if you will, that tend to involve very little or minimal effort on the part of the actor. Part of the role of the development educator, as I see it, is to enable learners to stand back from the dominant messages and ideas about development and about the global south that they're bombarded with on a daily basis, and to interrupt our habitual ways of thinking about the so-called first and third worlds. The task, as I see it, is to equip learners with a set of tools that will enable them to denaturalize and deconstruct the different development discourses as they appear in media, online, in textbooks and other curriculum resources, and to get them to critically engage with a range of questions about the effects of these various representations. Theoretically, this means engaging learners with the idea that any representation is inevitably a selective and particular depiction of some elements of reality, which generate some particular meaning while excluding others. And Audrey spoke earlier about the work of Stuart Hall, and Stuart Hall has been instrumental in informing and shaping our understandings of representations and the complex ways in which representation works. This constructivist approach to representation opens up the possibility for conversations about how different representational strategies and practices invite us to imagine and engage with development and with so-called distant others in potentially very different ways. Looking critically at a particular development image or film or text, students can ponder whether it invites them to imagine and relate to the suffering of distant others in terms of a politics of pity or in terms of a politics of justice. Does it portray us or the country or region to which we belong as part of the solution or part of the problem? Does it portray victims of suffering primarily as a commodity to be consumed or as individuals worthy of our humanity? Are we called to respond to the suffering of others through individualized actions or through demanding ethical and political changes that seek to undermine and break down the structures of injustice? Matt Bailey-Smith defines development education as, and I'm quoting him here, a range of informal and formal processes in the North that foster critical and reflexive understanding of issues of global development and unequal interdependence. He explains that in fostering reflexivity and understandings of interdependence, development education demands critical interrogation of the self as much as of the so-called other. And as part of this self-interrogative process, therefore, we need to encourage students to reflect on what it is that informs their assumptions about development. And we should ask them to consider how their life experiences filter their own understandings of it. Development education, as I understand it, is about enabling people to see themselves as active participants within a wider framework of global responsibility, including an emphasis on how and in what ways they function as accomplices to or beneficiaries of the impoverishment and suffering of others. Brandon Wisson, in a 2012 article, advanced what I think is a very useful concept. They talk about this notion of the imperial mode of living in reference to the current global environmental crisis. The imperial mode of living refers to dominant patterns of production and consumption that are deeply rooted in the everyday practices of the upper and middle classes in the global north and increasingly in countries such as China, Brazil and India in the global south. These authors observe that those with the highest levels of education, relatively high incomes and high environmental consciousness have the highest per capita resource use, while those with lower environmental consciousness and lower incomes use fewer resources. These realities demand that we open up difficult and uncomfortable conversations about our role in the immiseration of others. Stephen Cleese remarks that, and again this is a quote, the fact that the market pays someone $1.50 for a day of backbreaking labour while others get millions of dollars for their white-collar labour is akin to a form of slavery for which no one takes responsibility and which is disguised by the rhetoric of freedom, end quote. Viewing the development education classroom as a site of discomfort opens up the possibility to engage learners with uncomfortable truths about their participation in a political economic system that's akin to slavery, which benefits a minority of the world's inhabitants at the expense of a majority who are located primarily, although by no means exclusively, in the global south. As educators, we have a political as well as pedagogical responsibility to engage our students with what Deborah Britzman calls difficult knowledge. Knowledge that uproots us from our comfort zone and forces us to examine our own complicity in the knowledge we're confronted with. This means that for development education to be a meaningful encounter for learners, it cannot be disarticulated from the local, but must be rooted in people's own experiences and situated lives. This necessitates making explicit local-global linkages, whether in terms of highlighting the connection between the global consequences of local everyday choices, actions or behaviours, drawing parallels between local and global experiences and manifestations of oppression, or highlighting the ways in which international political economic arrangements and issues are intertwined with people's lived realities in different contexts. It also means drawing upon local as well as global illustrations of the extent to which dominant political economic arrangements have resulted in the extraction of wealth from those who can least afford it, and being more honest about the limitations of the proposed mechanisms and frameworks, such as the Millennium Development Goals, that have been supposedly developed to resolve or ameliorate the most pressing global problems, but which in effect serve what Stephen Cleese calls a compensatory legitimation function for states and agencies who are deeply implicated in the perpetuation of global poverty. I think there's a range of preparatory steps that educators need to take when addressing such difficult knowledge in their classes. It's really important, I think, that we as educators prepare our students for the range of emotions that they may experience as part of this pedagogical process of discomfort. That we provide dedicated spaces wherein student teachers can address their questions and concerns, and that we offer them concrete tools and strategies for addressing controversial and complex issues within their own classrooms. And it's at this point that I'm going to make a plug for the Education That Matters book, because I do think it offers lots of both kind of important conceptual, theoretical, as well as practical tools for engaging students with this so-called difficult knowledge as it relates to development that Deborah Britzman speaks of. Ultimately, as educators, I see that it's our responsibility to foster a culture of inquiry about our own emotional investments, in particular understandings and conceptions of ourselves as good human beings, and to prepare students for the range of emotions that they're likely to experience as part of their educational journey of learning to see the world differently and of coming to inhabit what Megan Bowler terms more morally ambiguous selves. So I'm just going to end with a poem that I think embodies this notion of a pedagogy of discomfort. Again, I'm kind of drawing very heavily there from the work of Megan Bowler. And the poem is by Primo Levi. It's If This Is a Man. You who live safe in your warm houses, you who find returning in the evening hot food and friendly faces, consider if this is a man who works in the mud, who does not know peace, who fights for a scrap of bread, who dies because of a yes or no. Consider if this is a woman without hair and without name, with no more strength to remember, her eyes empty and her womb cold, like a frog in winter. Meditate that this came about. I command these words to you. Carve them in your hearts, at home, in the street, going to bed, rising. Repeat them to your children, or may your house fall apart, may illness impede you, and may your children turn their faces from you. Thank you.